Let's dive into foundation paper piecing while making the inner star block. This block is made of 5 square and a square units that are made with foundation piecing and 4 simple 4-patch blocks that are made in the regular way. When joined together, the dark fabric creates an outer flower shape which leaves an inner star shape in the background fabric, which I've accentuated with some effective echo quilting. Hi everyone, Monica here. Welcome to part 7 of Time to Bloom. If you're new here, this is our 2024 online mystery quilt course. It's quilt as you go, it's skill building, and every month you also get a bonus applique pattern designed by my daughter Pattern Poole. The tutorials are free for everyone to learn and enjoy on YouTube, and if you'd like to make the quilt, you can sign up to the course on our website. You'll find a link in the description. This month's bonus applique block features a cute little beetle, and this month's patchwork block technique is an introduction to foundation piecing. So we've crossed the halfway line, and how fun is it that we're quilting each block as we go? It's exciting to think that at the end of the course they'll be joined together with my easy cover strip method, and once they're joined together, all you'll have to do is bind the quilt and you're finished. You won't be left with just a quilt top, and you'll have a beautiful quilted quilt. And because we're quilting small sections, we can really embellish each block with lots of quilting to give a custom quilted look to the finished product. Okay, so let's get started with the foundation paper piecing. As you'll see in this video, foundation paper piecing is a great way to make very accurate patchwork blocks. All you'll need is regular 80 GSM printing paper. However, the lighter the paper, the easier it will be to remove. I'm using a size 70 GSM paper that I was able to find at Officeworks in Australia, so it's a little bit lighter. Set your machine up with a neutral colour thread on the top and bottom and an open toe foot so that you can easily see the lines on the paper. Insert a size 90 needle and set your stitch length to 1.8. This is a thicker needle and a shorter stitch length than what is usually used for patchwork, and the reason for this is that the thicker needle and shorter stitch length will help the paper to tear away more easily. And a tip for working efficiently is to have a cutting mat and an ironing mat next to your machine so that you can trim, stitch and press without having to move away from your machine after each step. I would no steam in the iron because steam could make the paper soft and distort it. Here are my pieces all cut out and ready to sew. You'll find the cutting instructions in the Part 7 Time to Bloom course notes. Cut all the 3.5 inch background squares once on the diagonal. This can be done 2 at a time and will make 20 triangles. Set these triangles aside until required. And I just wanted to note that with foundation piecing, the pieces are always cut larger to begin with, and that's just going to allow some trimming while we're making the blocks. Print out 1 page of the foundation template A and 4 pages of template B. Template A should measure 4.5 inches square and template B should measure 4.5 inches by 5.5 inches. If not, adjust your printer settings until it measures the correct size. If you're having issues with printing to the correct size, I have a blog post that you may find helpful, so I'll put a link for this in the description for you to check out later. Cut each template out, cutting about 1/8 of an inch outside the line. Don't cut exactly on the line just yet, and you'll see why later. Okay, so let's make template A first. When complete, this is what template A will look like. It's a square and a square that's turned on point with background triangles sewn on each edge. You'll see that each section of the foundation template is numbered and labelled with the fabric to use. Each line has a letter starting with the letter A. So you work in numerical and alphabetical order, but with this block it doesn't really matter because it's just a simple square with triangles sewn around the edge, but it's just really good to get used to working in the kind of correct process if you were to make a more complicated block. A tip is to trace over each line with a tracing wheel. This will make perforated lines in the paper. To protect your cutting mat, turn it over to the wrong side or use an old cutting mat. Roll over each line using a ruler to help keep the lines straight. The perforated lines will make it easy to fold on the lines. It will also help you to see the lines on the back of the paper, and it will make it easy to remove the paper when the block is complete. You can also make the perforated lines by sewing on the lines with no thread in your needle. However, most modern machines will not let you sew if the machine is not threaded. You could skip this step if you were using an opaque paper where you could see the lines on the back of the paper. However, with this video, I'm showing you how to do foundation paper piecing just using regular printer paper. Now, the first thing to remember about foundation piecing is that the back of the paper will be the right side of the block. So turn the paper to the blank side and place the 3.5 inch medium color square in the middle with the right side facing up. Turn back to the printed side and hold it up to the light to make sure that there is an even amount of fabric extending past each line. Place the template and fabric flat on your work surface with the printed side up and place one flathead pin in the center. It's important that this fabric square is centered. That will ensure that there's going to be enough fabric around the edge to be able to trim back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So hold it up to the light again, just to double check to make sure that everything is pinned in place correctly. Fold back on line A and trim the excess fabric back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then unfold the paper and turn to the fabric side. Place a background triangle right sides together with the trimmed edge, making sure that it is centered with an even amount extending past each edge of the square. You can either pin the triangle in place, making sure that it is well away from the edge to be stitched, or hold it in place with your hands as you head to the sewing machine. Turn to the printed side of the paper and sew exactly on line A. I have my machine set to an automatic tie-off at the beginning and end, or you can do a small back stitch to start and finish. Only sew the length of the line. Remove the pin and turn to the fabric side. Set the seam, open out the triangle, finger press the seam, then press with the iron. Now you'll know that you're on the right track if the fabric is extending past the template. We'll need to have full coverage of this piece, including the seam allowance. Now repeat the process with piece 3, which is another background triangle. Fold the paper back on line B and trim the excess fabric back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Unfold the paper and turn to the fabric side. Place a background triangle right sides together with the trimmed edge, making sure that it is centered with an even amount extending past each edge of the square. Hold in place and head to the machine to sew. Turn to the printed side of the paper to sew. A tip is that you can fold the paper back to check that the two fabric edges are aligned and the same amount of the triangle is extending past both edges of the square. Now sew exactly on line B, starting and finishing with an automatic tie-off or a back stitch. Turn to the fabric side, open out the triangle and press with a 3-step pressing technique to ensure that there are no tiny creases are pressed into the seam. We now have 2 triangles on opposite sides of the square. Now let's sew on piece number 4. Fold back on line C and trim the excess fabric back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Unfold the paper and turn to the fabric side. Place a background triangle right sides together with the trimmed edge, hold in place and head to the machine to sew. Turn to the printed side of the paper and sew on line C. Turn to the fabric side, open out the triangle and press. So that's 3 triangles. Make sure that each triangle is covering its space, including the seam allowance. Now for piece number 5. Fold back on line D and trim the excess fabric back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Unfold the paper and turn to the fabric side. Place a background triangle right sides together with the trimmed edge, hold in place and head to the machine to sew. Turn to the printed side of the paper and sew on line D. Turn to the fabric side, open out the triangle and press. Now that all pieces are sewn onto foundation template A, turn to the printed side and trim on the outside line. And here is our perfect 4.5 inch square or square and a square with all points that finish a 1/4 inch away from the edge. Now set block A aside while we make template B. When complete, this is what template B will look like. It's the same as template A except it has a dark square and a strip across the bottom edge. So go ahead and follow the same steps to sewing on the fabric pieces, but just don't trim on the outside line just yet. Fold back on line E and trim the excess fabric back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Place a 1 3/4 inch by 4 3/4 inch strip right sides together with the trimmed edge and head to the machine to sew. Sew exactly on line E. Turn to the fabric side, flip the strip over and press. Check that all pieces are covering their space, including the seam allowance. Now trim on the outer line. The B blocks will measure 4.5 inches by 5.5 inches. The outer points will all finish a 1/4 inch away from the raw edge and the bottom point will meet the horizontal seam line perfectly. And that's a great thing about foundation piecing. If you ensure that your templates are printed out to the correct size and you sew exactly on the line, your blocks are going to turn out perfectly. So go ahead and make another 3 of block B and set them aside until required. Final pieces to the inner star block are these simple 4-patch blocks. They're called a 4-patch block because they have 4 pieces. To make the 4-patch blocks, start by sewing the 2.5 inch light squares right sides together with the 2.5 inch by 3.5 inch background rectangles. Press the seams to the darkest fabric. Sew the remaining 2.5 by 3.5 inch background rectangles right sides together with the remaining 3.5 inch dark squares. Once again, press the seam to the darkest fabric. So the units with the small light squares right sides together with the units with the large dark squares, the seams will nest as they are facing in opposite directions. Now that all units for this block are complete, it's time to remove the foundation paper before joining the pieces together to make the complete block. Now, depending on the type of foundation block that you're making, you could actually leave the paper in while you continue joining the units together. And the reason for this is that sometimes the fabric may end up off grain on the edge, so the paper actually helps to stabilize the fabric so there's no stretching when you go to join it together. However, with this simple block, all fabric edges are stable as they are on the straight grain or cross grain of the fabric, and removing the paper now is easier than removing the paper when the block is all joined together. So gently remove the paper, being careful that no stitching comes undone, which it shouldn't as the stitch length was set quite small to begin with. And tweezers are handy for removing the last tiny bits of paper that are caught in the stitching lines. Press each unit again, then double check that the size is correct before we start to join the block together. Now for the fun part, it's time to lay out the units to form the inner star block. Separate the pieces into 3 rows. The middle row is simple as there are no points that need to line up because they are separated by the strips. In the bottom and top row, you need to line up the points of the on-point squares with the horizontal seams of the 4 patch blocks. To do this, place 2 pieces right sides together with the on-point square on top. Insert a pin at the point of the corner where the stitching lines meet. Then insert the pin through the seam of the underneath piece a 1/4 inch in from the edge. Hold the pieces together, then push the pin back up to the top layer of the fabric. Now pin the edges, making sure that all layers of the fabric are level. Change to a size 70 needle and a stitch length of 2 and use a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance to join the pieces together, just in the same way that we showed in the part 1 block video. I like to flip the pieces over and sew with the 4 patch block on top because this way the seam is facing down in the direction that I'm sewing. Take it nice and slow and slide the pins out just before you get to them. Set the seam, then finger press, then press with the iron. And I'm quite happy with how my point is level with the horizontal seam of the 4 patch block. Instead of pinning, the other option is to trust that you have made the units accurately and glue base the pieces together, which is what I do as I find that pinning can sometimes buckle the fabric and glue basting holds the pieces much flatter for sewing. I just pop my ruler on top of my ironing mat to protect it. I then apply tiny dabs of glue within the seam allowance, then press to speed up the drying process before sewing. When the rows are complete, press the seams in the top and bottom row out and press the seams in the middle row in. Now join the rows together, nesting the seams and aligning them with pins or glue basting. Press the seams away from the center. Now sew on the background borders, then layer the pieces together with the batting and backing. Hold together with safety pins and quilt the block. You'll find the quilting instructions in the course notes. So that's our introduction to foundation paper piecing. We really hope that you enjoyed this video and we'll see you in part 8. Thanks for watching everyone. Bye!